This is really kind of a trial talk video. I think they call it vlogging. And I had a nice experience today. I met two new friends. I won't mention their names because they might not want me to do that. But I wanted to talk just a little bit about the value of sharing with friends. I know that most everyone I'm speaking to who is a Christian has probably heard the same sermons about Peter and his denial of Christ. And often he comes across as being negative, even cowardly. And we've had preachers say, but I can relate to him because there have been times when I've been cowardly. And that's probably about the worst thing that we could say about Peter because, in fact, it isn't true. First of all, let me lay some groundwork. If you remember in Matthew 16, when Jesus is talking to Peter and the other disciples, he says, "Whom do you say that I am?" And Peter immediately pipes up and says, "You are the Christ, you're the Son of the living God." And Jesus said, "Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who's in heaven." And what he says next is a clue to where Peter's going in this story. He says to Peter and to the others, "Don't tell anyone who I am." Peter has just had the revelation from God himself as to who Jesus is. So that's proof positive that Jesus doesn't need any other confirmations except his Father who's in heaven. So he says to the disciples, "Do not tell anyone who I am." Okay, that lays some groundwork now for what Peter's going to do next. But we also need to remember that when Jesus speaks of his being crucified, Peter quickly says, "Oh, no, that's not going to happen, but I am not going to let that happen to you." And so that's another point that we need to remember that Peter was impetuous, yes, but Peter was solid on the fact that he wasn't going to allow anything to happen to Jesus. So when the soldiers come to get Jesus, well, the first thing Peter does is lop off one of their ears. And this is a good sign that Peter is not cowardly. Peter has done something that could immediately get him killed, but in fact, to save Jesus, he does just that. He lops off the ear of that soldier. And we know the story that Jesus healed the soldier's ear. But as Jesus was taken away by the soldiers, the other disciples departed. But Peter followed closely behind and watched, probably in the darkness, as they were taking Jesus away, taking him to his trial. And when Peter got to the trial, he stood on the outskirts of what was going on so as not to be seen, to decide from what he heard what was going on. Well, the one thing he heard was that they were looking for witnesses to Jesus and to Jesus' claim to be the King of the Jews. And they needed someone to verify that. And here's Peter standing now outside. Remember, Peter's been told by Jesus, "Don't tell anybody who I am." And knowing that they were going to be looking for witnesses, Peter immediately stepped aside, and as he's often betrayed, to warm himself by the fire. And that was not to get out of being in the line of fire, but in fact, Peter knew who Jesus was. And Jesus also knew beforehand that Peter would be in that position. So when they asked Peter, "Aren't you the one that was hanging around that Jesus?" And of course, Peter says, absolutely not. Two things would have happened. Either he would have admitted as to who Jesus is, and Jesus would have been found guilty, or he would have denied him. So either way, Peter was going to be in a bad position. So Jesus has already told Peter, do not tell anyone who I am. Now, Jesus understood and knew that he was going to be crucified, and he also knew that he was going to die. But Peter didn't know that. Peter didn't know that Jesus was going to die, whether he admitted who he was or not. And so Peter did the only thing Peter knew to do. Now, remember, after the crucifixion, when Jesus says to the witnesses of the resurrection, go and tell the others and Peter. And why did he say that? He knew that Peter was going to be sorrowful. Peter was ashamed. What did Peter do after the crucifixion? He went fishing, and he went fishing naked. Now, the importance of the nakedness is in the law, when a person felt ashamed, he stripped his clothes because his clothing was a covering. And when he stripped his clothes, it was his indication that he was ashamed. He felt that he had betrayed Christ, despite the fact that he told Jesus, I won't let anything happen to you. But Jesus knew these things, and that's why he said, go and tell the disciples and Peter. Make sure Peter knows I'm alive and all is well. So Peter was not a coward. Peter was true to what Peter knew to do, but he didn't know the full story. And if somehow Peter could have kept Jesus from being crucified, then in fact we wouldn't have the resurrection, and we wouldn't have salvation and the born again experience. So let's examine Scripture. Let's don't just take for granted one little excerpt from the Scripture that's been preached and preached and preached about over and over, and assume that it's right just because it's been repeated over and over again. So I leave you with that word. Use discernment. Pray about reading the word. And in fact, read the words in the word. And give your proof text when you believe something. Don't just believe it because some famous evangelist told you. And that's all I have to say tonight. And thanks for listening. And perhaps I'll be back again. Thank you and good night.